I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with a small print. And today my guest is Mary Harrington. And as always, we ask people to introduce themselves, mostly because many of the people I talk to I don't know all that well. So will you start off by telling us who you are or how you like to be introduced?
My name is Mary Harrington. I am a contributing editor at the UK current affairs magazine Unheard. I pinged Bronwyn out of the blue a few weeks back to say, hey, we should talk, because I think we just have a bunch of common interests. So I'm here with absolutely no agenda and no axis that I really want to grind, but just to kind of shoot the breeze and find out what Bronwyn thinks about everything, really.
Oh, good. Fantastic. So this show is about, as it's literally called, the small print. We try to get into the detail, the fine unintended consequences and trade-offs involved in a lot of the big conversations that are going to be shaping the future of our society, ideally with a view to looking at how policy issues, either current ones or emerging future issues that are going to dictate policy, are going to affect us as citizens in whatever the new world order is shaping up to be. So a lot of the people we talk to either come from the background of economics, politics, or journalism, and we speak to quite a lot of futurists too. But I'm particularly interested in your views because you seem to cut across quite a lot of different subjects that I'm quite interested in, everything from sex and politics and, again, markets. And there was an article that you wrote a few months back, I think it was around about in May, when you were talking about the sort of marketplace of relationships. So I thought that would be an interesting place to start, because when it comes to issues of gender and family and marriage and money, everything becomes very, very interconnected. And of course, we set up these incentives through how our legal structures support or fail to support various different family dynamics. Maybe just to start off with, a particular question I could get into, which is what's sort of gone wrong with the marketplace for families as you see it right now?
Well, I wrote that article it was a very long-winded way of getting to grips with a question which has bothered me for some time, which is, it's not even a question, it's just a phrase. People talk routinely nowadays about the sexual marketplace as if that's always been a thing. And it's one of those phrases that sticks in my mind, and then I go for a long run and it bugs me in the shower, and it just hangs around in the back of my head, and I think, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this picture? And so that essay was really an effort to answer the question, why is sex not a marketplace? Or why has it not always been a marketplace? Or in what ways has it become a marketplace, and how is that changing? And it ended up being a much more historical piece than I expected, because I ended up going right the way back to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, or rather not so much The Wealth of Nations as the other book that he wrote, which he intended as a complement to that book, which is less often discussed than The Wealth, or less often quoted, which is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he set out his anthropology, which I think was intended as to be complementary to his idea of his vision of human society and the invisible hand and so on. And in this, he imagined that he came up with this idea of sympathy, which he wasn't the only person who talked about sympathy at that time, but I'm paraphrasing, but his understanding of sympathy was the innate ability that humans have to experience, or empathetically to experience, what other people are experiencing. And in his view, moral sentiments arose from that capacity for empathy with other people, or the ability to experience things as other people was experiencing it. And what I wanted to look at was the way in which that actually turns out to be a very atomized and a very solipsistic way of looking at things. And I wanted to draw a picture of the way in which our understanding of marketplaces shifted over the course of the transition from a pre-modern, a medieval society to a modern society, and how that's now changing again. And I took as that. I'll get round to sex in a minute, but bear with me.
Okay.
I took as that for that of the metaphor of the marketplace in my own small town in the Shires in England, which used to house something called a shambles, which was a physical marketplace for live animals and for selling animals and for slaughtering animals. And so it was a pretty bloody and visceral place, the animals milling around, animals being butchered. Probably, I don't know, but you can imagine there'd be stalls there selling hot food. And so it was very, very bloody, very visceral, very right in your face. And over the course of the transition to the modern world, that market, the shambles was eventually demolished, and what replaced it was a much sort of tidy 18th century marketplace with shops around the edge, and people would come, and there's a little library in the middle, and everything's much tidier. And the slaughter, the bloody business of survival, life and death and entrails and meat and so on, was sort of transferred to spaces outside of civil society. So now it happens on the margins. And I argue that you can draw a metaphorical parallel there with what happened with the shift in the way people understood sexual relationships between the medieval and the modern era. So instead of a pretty pragmatic and actually pretty sexual understanding of marriage, in which all you really needed in order for a marriage to be considered permanent, binding, and just for forever after, was for the couple to have promised to one another without witnesses and to have had sex. That was all it took in the medieval era for a marriage to be considered valid. But as things shifted from an agrarian to an industrial footing, it was no longer acceptable for families who put a lot of effort into cultivating marriageable daughters for suitably eligible husbands, for those daughters to be seduced by somebody with a nice smile and a familiar manner. And so there was a lot of pressure for the state to become involved and for witnesses to become involved and for more safeguards to be put in place to the idea of marriage. And out of that, gradually you have an evolution into the sort of respectable bourgeois understanding of marriage, where bans have to be published and witnesses, state representatives have to be involved for a marriage to be considered legal. And all of a sudden it's a much more surveilled and much more regulated matter, because when you look at the economics of what's being constructed on top of the basic sexual union, it's a much more complex thing, and it's much less rooted in place, and it's much less rooted in belonging to that. It's not safe to leave it just in the hands of two people who shag and then that's it. But I wanted to develop that on. To look at how that's changing again, because when I think about the marketplace in my small town, it does better than many physical high streets in the world. But on the whole, the physical high street is declining. This is not news. Anybody who's been awake reading anything for the last 15 years can see that that marketplaces now happen online. And so I wanted to bring into that the idea. I wanted to look at the way relationships are formed now. And actually, when I think of the dissolution from the sort of bourgeois industrial era understanding of how we form relationships and why we form relationships has been liquefying for some time. I mean, that liquefaction was well underway when I was a teenager. My mum was giving me advice which was perhaps appropriate in the 1960s, which her parents had given her. If you go on a date with a young man, then you don't owe him anything. Because he's had the pleasure of your company. And I remember listening to this and thinking, but people don't go on dates. They hook up at parties. This doesn't compute. And this was back in the 1990s. And of course, the whole thing has accelerated and liquefied still further now, because now we have dating apps, which were just coming in at the point where I was dating to marry, which was some time ago now. And which, back in the late noughties, you could go on a dating website and find somebody who wanted to get married. And that doesn't, I've been off the market for a long time, but that doesn't really seem to be how it works now. No. You go on a dating website and you find, I'm not completely sure what, but not that. So what I wanted to, and where I got to at the end of that argument is that we seem to have arrived at a point where actually what's being commodified now is no longer, the marriage and relationships are no longer being ring-fenced as a sort of safe space external to the market, which was what Adam Smith imagined. He imagined that moral sentiments and sympathy would be a space which could be kept safe from the market. And he constructs the two in opposition to one another. But in fact, that the arrival of the internet has collapsed that. And in fact, now what's now being commodified is the whole domain of sympathy, the whole domain of the soul, if you like. And really, most of the platforms, the platform economies that we're watching now are engaged in an increasingly intense race to the bottom when it comes to commodifying the human soul, including obviously the sex drive, because that's one of the most powerful sort of basic drivers that we have. So I guess, it would probably have been quicker for you, to be honest, to have just read the article, but having given you that lengthy summary of it.
But you put it exactly right. And I think there's like particularly two threads that come through. It's the commodification of everything, absolutely everything. The commodification of care is particularly concerning, where you get to the point that mothers feel like they need to be financially compensated for looking after their own progeny, which is, I think, quite astonishing, considering that most of us live in free Western societies whereby becoming a parent is pretty much entirely your choice as a mother. But to still see that you then sort of entitled to compensation for the care that you give out, I think is quite extraordinary. And that ripples through, of course, into romantic relationships too, and commodifying all of those interactions, not being able to hold that space for non-transactory relationships at all. I mean, I had this conversation with a few people last week, and people are like, well, all relationships are transactory. They should be. And to a certain extent, they are. But a transactory relationship based on an exchange of roles and responsibilities is quite different from literally putting a price on people's actual human interactions. And the second point that you bring up there is the politicization of everything and the regulation of more natural human relations, which is something that only we do really as a species, as humans. We like to be involved in other people's business or in having a say over how our relationships pan out and what the rules are for them. And I think that links into the commoditization of all of this very closely, because as soon as something is regulated, it does become priced into the marketplace. There are very real sort of financial rewards or financial incentives to engage in legal marriage type relationships or to quantify any sorts of care-based relationships, because as soon as it becomes regulated, it gets sort of trapped into that system, which I think is quite interesting from a sort of political philosophy perspective, in that we tend to think of the state as being separate from the world of business and commerce and capitalism and everything else. But the two are really, really do go together. They're not separate entities. It's kind of the same thing. What do you think about that? Am I talking to your page?
I think so, yeah. I mean, the collapse of state regulation into commercial interests has been, again, underway for some time. I remember saying back at the beginning of the pandemic, people, all sorts of people had all sorts of hopeful ideas about how the pandemic was going to shock us back into some measure of normality. And I watched various hedge funds circling around various collapsing businesses, and I saw how that was likely to pan out. And I thought, this is. Everyone still hopes that the West is going to become, still hopes that China is going to become more like the West by embracing capitalist norms. And, to my eye, the pandemic is going to force everybody to become more like China, because the only way that the commercial world is going to be able to survive all of the sort of pretend voluntarism that we still ascribe to it. The only way we're going to be able to keep all of that intact is via massive state subsidy of basically everything. So the only way we're going to get through the pandemic is by nationalizing everything, which basically means that the West just becomes China with a few sort of opt-in rituals that make it look a little bit more like we signed up to this voluntary. So I mean, I would say that the total convergence of the state and the business interests in the state is now, certainly in the United Kingdom and certainly in the United States, well on its way to being complete. At least when it comes to bigger businesses. I've seen nothing to disabuse me of that. I mean, what the terrain looks like in South Africa, I'm not well enough informed to understand in detail what's happening. My sense is that your political and social terrain is quite different, so I don't really know how it's working for you over there. But certainly in highly developed economies and highly developed, highly technologized societies where there's very little space outside technocapital, that convergence is a done deal. And where we go from here, I think, is an interesting question.
Oh, absolutely. I don't think there's that much of a distinction here in South Africa. The main difference being that we have a weak state rather than a strong state, but the same ideas are in play, the same policies are trying to be pushed. I think it's quite interesting to see how all of these sort of agendas and all of these things that we've been dabbling with in terms of more censorship, more regulation, more control being deferred to central authorities are quite consistent, whether you come from a rich market or a poor one. Of course, how they are actually implemented depends on how strong your state is. So I have joked quite a lot saying that I think the best place to be in the world right now is in a state or that is not in a particularly good state. So a weak state will be less able to implement a lot of these things that we're talking about. But it does tend to be quite inevitable. And I was having a conversation with another friend who I will not mention because they might be horrified that I've dragged them into this, but talking about how Hitler himself said that one of the best things about having and building a totalitarian state is that it forces everyone else to become totalitarian too in order to compete with it, which is hard to argue against, really, which comes back to the point you're making about China versus the West. And it's essentially the same thing. This is not the Cold War sort of 2.0. It's not quite the same thing because they are so completely in bed with each other. The Beijing and Washington consensus need each other as much as, to use American politics, the Democratic Party needs the Republican Party in order to survive. They are entirely enmeshed. If you look at what's happening now with the Chinese economy and how that's falling into a US debt crisis, it's all part of the same system. It's all part of the same debt-based system that is increasingly requiring the sort of growth at all costs in order to fuel. That is, of course, the catch with any debt-based business, economy, or nation, is that you have to have growth. And that growth often has to be forced in order to continue, which is why we see more and more economic manipulation of everything. And we see more and more sort of requirements for people to participate in this game, if not voluntarily, then a bit more by force. So everything seems to be converging at the same time, everything from central bank digital currencies with programmable money that can be taken away if you don't behave and fall in with the rules. And what we have right now is actually the technological ability to actually do that. And the temptation is just too great from anyone, from any sort of point of power or wealth, to really say no to these things. What does it mean to give up a little bit more privacy or a little bit more freedom in exchange for a little bit more of your commitment to the greater good, which is definitely the way we seem to be tending at the moment. So as soon as you have very, very big populations, we're very difficult to manage. I mean, we are very messy as human beings. Left to our own devices, we cause chaos and complexity. So it's much easier to harmonize us and to make sure that we're all playing by the same set of rules. And I think that this brings back to that whole point I was talking about earlier about the commoditization of absolutely everything. I think it's not just the commoditization.
Very, very, very closely connected. I've argued elsewhere that I borrowed Martin Heidegger, his idea of standing reserve. This idea of under technology, Heidegger argues, everything becomes a standing reserve. As it becomes a resource to be instrumentalized in the service of technology. Now, of course, he was talking, some time before the invention of the internet. But I don't think he'd have disagreed with the idea that under network platform oligarch conditions, we've simply been able to add to the list of things which are now standing reserve a whole range of human emotions, human longings, human desires, and if you like, the higher needs of the soul. And in a sense, the transition to commodifying those aspects of human life are simply just it's the same mechanism moving on to strip mine a new set of resources, having exhausted an older one. And it's my view that those parts of humanity which make us human are fundamentally the things which resist being turned into standing reserve, and that actually, if you look historically, for example, at the history of Western colonialism, a huge amount of it has been about sometimes forcibly transforming from relational goods, transforming things from relational goods into standing reserve. Whether you're talking about the expulsion, the enclosure of the commons in Britain, or for example, the punitive expedition in Benin was one that I cited as an example, where essentially that was about an African nation that didn't want to engage with the British on British terms of free trade, and what eventually went down was a massacre, at the end of which, having completely destroyed the city of Benin, the British cut down their sacred tree and installed a golf course with the final hole where the sacred tree used to be. I think nothing could speak more eloquently of the violence that's sometimes involved in transforming things from relational goods to standing reserve. And I mean, and to my eye, pretty much the same process is underway when, for example, you transform the relational goods, the relational business of forming an intimate partnership into something which can be monetized on OnlyFans. It's very much the same. It's very much the same order of thing as massacring the population of Benin and then installing a golf course where their secretary used to be. So
as soon as it's monetized, it becomes flattened and tradable. Commoditizable also means sort of makes it more interchangeable, makes us all fungible rather than non-fungible in our sort of place in society. But I think it's a really interesting point that when it comes to sort of debates that take place in political consensus and social media, you tend to have people that are either arguing against capitalism or for more statism. But for most of us on the ground, it makes almost no difference. Whatever that sort of totalism comes from, is a rule by a platform that's managed by a for-profit board all that different for a rule by a platform that's managed by a less for-profit to more communitarian kind of governments? It actually makes no difference. What we're really talking about here is a difference between the individual as a human being and the individual as a human resource in a much more totalitarian state, because that's the tendency that's coming from everywhere. And that's hard to talk about because it's so much easier to fall into sort of binary thinking around political agendas and to who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. But it's not even a case of that. It's a case of a conversation around a completely faceless bureaucracy that is trying to flatten you into a particular form, to turn you into a resource and to remove you from your personal identity and clawing back that little bit of space. But I do speak quite often that any sort of freedom and any sort of, whether that you're talking about privacy or physical freedom or common ground or whatever that case may be, is at risk of the tragedy of the commons, because there's always a reason for someone to reduce that common space. There's always a special interest group that stands to gain by reducing that common ground. And there's very little that you can actually gather together in order to defend that, because the value of that common ground, that space, whether it's privacy or freedom or literal plots of land, it's only valuable when it's actually distributed. So the value is distributed. It isn't concentrated in a particular individual's hands. So it's very hard to rally people with more sort of libertarian or libertine tendencies together, because by definition, it's almost an oxymoron, right? How do you gather people together to defend essentially the indefensible? Because there's always a reason for more commodification. There's always a reason to take away a little bit more of that private space and hand it over into the sort of the common good setup. I'm just not sure how you unravel this at this point, given that we now have the technological ability to do a lot of this flattening for all intents and purposes. I think that the most compelling example for me to sort of maybe illustrate this point so I don't sound quite so crazy is what's happening with the commodification of our bodies. I think that as soon as you have any sort of national health insurance, whereby the commons, the collective, the taxpayer, whatever sort of economic system you have, is taking on the risk of individuals' bodies and the maintenance thereof, that collective has a right to surveil and to control what sort of risks you take on as an individual. And I find this particularly fascinating because our modern welfare state, which sort of took off everywhere in the world after the Second World War, is less than a generation old. So we actually have no idea how this plays out, over time. And the tendency is that essentially what we have not realized is by trading away our risk to other people or sort of collectivizing that risk, we also sort of giving up the right to our own person. We now have a price of how much we are worth investing in terms of healthcare and in terms of education. And we have an obligation, therefore, to make sure that we are actually providing that value that we're taking for society in exchange. So this comes through in everything from getting people to wear seatbelts or masks, which might be fantastically good things, all the way through to things like meat taxes and sugar taxes and what you're allowed to wear even. I don't know if you know, in my country last year, at the beginning of COVID, our government put out a notorious piece of legislation where they just told us what clothes we were allowed to buy, only appropriate clothing for the winter. Infamously on that list, they said no crop bottoms. Nobody really knew what a crop bottom was, but you got to the point that the government that is responsible for protecting and paying for us even felt it was within their mandate to tell us what clothing we were allowed to purchase and where during a pandemic. So I think it's really interesting that sort of, when you try and trade away a lot of your responsibility in exchange, you have to give up a lot of your freedom. And it's not something an individual can opt out of, because this is now a collective game. And that sort of tends to, where does that actually stop? As soon as you can categorize, harm as being a risk, then it's not even over to your own body that society has a say as to what you can and should do. It's also over how you can relate to other people in the public space. So I think that's also really, really interesting when you start to see the debates coming out now, that very serious people are saying that they don't want a future ever where anyone should be allowed to walk around mask-free in public, whether there is or is not a pandemic. We should consider that any risk for any disease coming forward is a good enough reason to close off that common space even more forever, because where do you stop when it comes to risk? What kind of a monster are you if you're not doing your part to minimize risk as much as possible, not just for yourself, but for everyone else? So I think that's a really interesting conversation. I would say that probably ties into a lot of what we're seeing right now, where it's not like some malevolent conspiracy to control us. Rather, it's just the logical conclusion of the game we've chosen to play. By separating risk and reward, we have given up perhaps more than we thought we were going to have to in that bargain.
This is a really interesting terrain, because I think actually here it's my observation that this nuances quite a bit by country. And in fact, local conditions on the ground make a big difference to how this plays out. I mean, local cultural norms and legislations, and it's very complex. Because I listen to what you're saying, and I recognize the discourse that you're speaking about, which to my eye emanates most strongly from American coastal elites. I can't speak to the situation in your country, obviously, but it's very much a minority in the United Kingdom, which is interesting. And I think speaks to specific cultural norms in the UK, and a sort of a fun, an ambivalence that the English generally, we talk a good talk when it comes to safetyism, but actually we don't believe the rules should apply to any of us as individuals ever. And when I was in London yesterday, nobody was masking. You go to the shops in the UK. I live out in Middle England. Nobody masks. It's just everyone's sick of it. Somebody texted me, it was my daughter's 5th birthday party the other day. We hired a bouncy castle. It was covered in screaming, sticky kids, all sort of, no COVID protocols. No, everyone, I think people would have looked at me like I was insane if I'd suggested that the parents should attend, wearing masks outside with their 5-year-olds all running around licking each other or whatever. This is everyone. They decorated cupcakes and took turns licking the spoon. It was all very unhygienic. I'm comfortable with that. Somebody texted me at the beginning of the start of the day. Well, sorry?
Very 1990s, like our carefree childhood.
I promised myself in the middle of the first lockdown that, the moment it was okay again and everybody stopped being quite so crazy about it, that I was going to hire a bouncy castle and I was going to cover it in children. And I was so happy when I finally got to do that.
Follow the law, but that's enough. Yeah.
Right. It was a symbolic moment for me that said, actually we just got through something, and I don't know quite where we are now, but so in Britain, I mean, all of this really to say that in Britain, amongst certainly outside neurotic rich people, extreme hygiene theatre is not really a thing. How that relates to and yet we have the most fiercely defended nationalized healthcare system in the world. So I would suggest that at least in the UK, those things don't necessarily map one-to-one onto one another. I would also offer as a counterpoint to the socialization of medicine and the commodification of the body that, in fact, perhaps counterintuitively, the NHS has functioned so far on a slightly different track here as a bulwark against the extremes of transgender medicine, where I think insurance-based health systems have offered a perverse incentive to accelerate the rollout of transgender medicine, because why would you not, if you're operating in an insurance-based system, extend the scope and complexity of healthcare at every possible opportunity? Whereas if you have a socialized healthcare system, the instincts of the system as a whole are fairly conservative. Effectively, inevitably with a socialized system, it results in a measure of rationing. It can't not. And that much was clear even at the beginning of the national health system. But one of the outcomes of that is that there are very fraught public debates in Britain about what should or should not be available on the NHS. And this is a standard feature of British tabloid discourse. Insert name of possibly optional healthcare treatment, and insert much harumphing from the tabloids about the fact that this is now available on the NHS. And what about our cancer patients and their long waiting lists? I mean, this is a standard tabloid trope. But when it comes to perhaps some aspects of identity-based medicine, as I like to think of it, it's serving as a buffer, and it's serving to decelerate the sort of headlong drive into transhumanism, which is evident in some other countries, where perhaps there's a perverse incentive in the opposite direction to accelerate that trend. So I would say that the political and economic and social textures of this are quite nuanced and probably depend a lot on local, legal, and cultural conditions. So, and it's not as straightforward as socialized healthcare necessarily resulting in a predictable set of effects. It's a much more textured discourse than that.
I would go in a slightly different direction there, in that, like I was saying earlier, we'd like to frame these debates in saying either it's free market capitalism or the state provides the service. I'm rather getting at that all roads are kind of leading to Rome. So I currently live in a society where we have an insurance-based healthcare system. The government's trying very, very hard to turn that into a national healthcare system, much modeled on yours. But what is quite interesting is that the same company that is our biggest monopoly, almost, medical health insurance company here in South Africa, is being involved with quite a lot of sort of nudge-based, behavioral, sort of points-based healthcare shoving going on in the UK too. It's the same company, the same algorithm. They also actually are partnered with the Chinese government in one of their biggest sort of insurers over there. And what I'm kind of saying is that all roads really lead to more information sharing, more society having a quantified claim over your body going forward. I don't think that not nationalizing the healthcare actually changes this at all. This all kind of tends in the same direction. I'm sure you've heard of the Sovereign Individual book, and I think that there's a quote towards the end of that really sort of speaks to this, and that says that basically the Western capitalist system has been more efficient and more effective at nationalizing basically the bodies and the property of citizens than the communist government was in the USSR. Effectively, all sort of roads tended up towards a greater centralized say over what's going on in the world of individuals, and a more sort of flattening and sort of basically just turning it towards the conformity of how we all behave in society. So the debates that you have in the UK.
I was very struck reading Benjamin Bratton's book recently, and what he defines as a positive biopolitics and an epidemiological view of society, which, on my reading at least, sees all of us as kind of interchangeable meat puppets that need to be managed in aggregate via a series of sort of semi-autonomous big data algorithms that nudge us in this direction or that in order to optimize the kind of human swarm, which is, I mean, in a way, he's really only saying the quiet part out loud. It's a mask off moment for something which is kind of evident. I think is the sort of unifying theme of everything that we've discussed in this chat so far. So it shouldn't really come as a shock. I mean, it's startling to read when you see it all just spelled out on the page there, and then with the coda, and this is all a good thing. But what's astonishing to me reading it is the complete. It's not just an indifference to the idea that humans have an interiority, or that humans may, that there exists such a thing as human subjectivity or interiority. It's this idea that actually proposing that there exists such a thing is not just outdated, it's bad, it's reactionary. The human, effectively he's saying that we need to abolish the human soul if we're going to govern people properly. I mean, that's my take. That's my central takeaway from the whole book, and that what we need instead is planetary scale computing to manage the human swarm. And as you've pretty much said, that seems to be generally where we're going.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's this nudge and jump through the various different hoops and sort of flatten, fall in line. And you can't argue against it, because how do you argue against more safety, or how do you argue against more health, or a greater quality of life? You know, these are the things that are basically being debated. I mean, everything from down as simple to things like cameras in the streets, which I know that you have quite a lot of. I think at one point the UK had more cameras per citizen than anywhere else in the world. I know we're trying quite hard too, but we've got a huge crime problem here in South Africa. I mean, depending on who you speak to, some statistics say that as a woman, you have like a 1 in 4 chance of being raped in your life. You know, like, how can you argue against street cameras and facial recognition surveillance in your suburb against those sorts of systems? And likewise on the more sort of bodily side, whether you are with a for-profit insurer or whether you are being insured by your state or your government, how can you opt out of, you know, wearing your Fitbit and making sure you're doing your 100 steps a day if other people are going to be subsidizing your couch potato habit, right? How do you actually honestly argue against that in the face of that sort of very obvious logic? But those are still talking about sort of real harm. So I think it gets more interesting when we start to redefine, as I said, harm as risk, because then it becomes an infinitely elastic conversation. Almost nothing could be unjustifiable in terms of the protection against risk. And if harm itself, even the risk of harm, and I think you can redefine harm as well as not just being physical harm, but also being sort of mental harm, then again, you have an almost infinitely elastic budget from which to, you know, increase control, surveillance, lack of freedom, whatever you want to call it. So I probably sound a little bit libertarian now, but it's really the point. There's almost no policy, there's almost no collectivist policy that cannot be justified, whether you're a for-profit entity.
Well, we're already seeing
or a state's instance.
We're already seeing public health being deployed routinely as a justification for whatever it is that people want to push. I mean, and in fact, we saw that even in the earliest days of the pandemic. You know, there were protests which were clamped down on because of COVID security, and then there were protests which were encouraged because whatever it was that they were protesting about was promptly redefined as a public health emergency.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's everything. That's just one case in point. They're legion once you start looking.
Yeah, exactly. It says, how do you argue against that? It's completely unjustifiable. You have to be prepared to be a heretic to speak out against any of this, because sooner or later someone's going to say that, you know, but what about the babies, right? I mean, even the sort of Apple privacy thing that was actually overturned because there were people far better than me that arguing these sorts of cases that said that, you know, maybe perhaps treating all of your customers as being guilty and already digitally strip searching their content before they've even been suspected of a crime might be a bit of an overstep. But then again, the policy was initially justified as to how can you not prevent a single instance of child sexual abuse? How could you argue against any measure that could save even one child's life or one child's future? And that's the argument that you have to argue against. You have to be prepared to be a bad guy and say that actually I'm prepared to take on more risk than perhaps the next guy is. And that's almost impossible to argue against and then still come across as being on the right side of history. It's just too easy to sort of slander you, to sort of drag you down to being the pariah for not doing everything in your power to reduce that risk. But then you come back to the whole sort of concept of the tyranny of the minority, and how over time in groups, the most intolerant always wins. The person with the lowest risk tolerance tends to get their way if everyone else does not have strong preferences. The strongest preference wins in these sorts of debates, not the largest majority. So this is not something that even the democratic process can prevent you against. I mean, like, I've been doing quite a lot of press here in South Africa about the various different, you know, attributes of how good or how bad things like vaccine mandates are. And the logic is that if you are a business, if you want business, you probably should impose a vaccine mandate on your patrons, because people that want, or patrons that want vaccine mandates, won't patronize your establishment if you don't have one. Whereas other people who might not want them would still be prepared to go through that in order to eat your establishment. It's the most extreme preference that wins through in these debates, which is very difficult again to argue with. But you're okay with being on the wrong side of current history, but hopefully the right side of future history. In progress, definitely based on on your articles. And I don't have much of a self-preservation instinct myself, so I do tend to talk about these things, which is, I think, why we connected a bit on Twitter. But how do you deal with that? I think that's maybe a useful question for people listening to this who are a bit horrified by the seemingly inevitable march towards more collectivism, more totalitarianism going on. Whether you're a capitalist or a socialist, there are some of us that are concerned about these things. How have you managed to be the voice of unreason, as I suppose that some people would categorize you in the space?
I think it helps that I don't believe in progress, and I kind of say that up front. I don't think it's a thing. I don't think providential. I don't think we're on a march towards never-ending improvement and the potential end goal of heaven on earth. I don't believe that.
You're not a singletarian, not going towards a singularity and a single transhumanism computer upload for all of us.
Not if I can help it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one.
I don't believe in progress, at least not in the sort of providential liberal sense. I think human culture evolves. That's obvious, but I don't think the sum total of human felicity is any greater now than it was, say, 5,000 years ago. Or at least I've seen nothing that convinces me of that. And the only way you can argue that things have improved over the last 5,000 years is by defining your terms. And the moment you define your terms, you've already begged the question. Because you've there isn't really anywhere to stand from which you can plausibly argue for progress as self-evidently a thing. So I just don't believe in it. And I think that helps, because when people tell me, well, that's not very progressive, I'm like, so what? Yeah, I don't believe in progress, so no, of course I'm not progressive. But also I think I'm just difficult to cancel. I started out, I sort of fell into journalism by accident at the age of 40, from a stint as a stay-at-home mum, and it's just very difficult to cancel a stay-at-home mum. Because, I mean, what are you going to do? Fire me? And so I've just, what are you going to, short of convincing my husband to divorce me, which is just a Twitter mob is unlikely to manage to do. It's very difficult to cancel a stay-at-home mum. And really the worst thing that can happen to me is that I go back to being a stay-at-home mum, which is a nice life. I mean, there's all I've ever really wanted to do in life was to be left alone to read and talk to interesting people. And there are much worse standpoints from which to do that than being a stay-at-home mum. So I sort of don't care, I guess. And also, but I'm not short of people willing to publish me as things stand. So I just don't feel like I am on the receiving end of any particularly serious flack as things stand. I think with these things, it depends a great deal what your commitments are and who you owe favors to and what your social circle is and so on. And it's fine for me, but I know I have friends for whom it's their situation makes it a lot more sensitive. Particularly friends in academia or friends with a set of commitments that complicate that. And there's no question in my mind that there are blasphemies now in a way which wasn't the case even 15 or 20 years ago.
There are literally blasphemy laws in Europe, which is astonishing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, it's no coincidence that hate crime laws jumped onto the statute book almost simultaneously in the United Kingdom with the final abolition of blasphemy laws, because it's in my but I mean, I'm not a libertarian here, because in my view, it's not possible to have a functioning society without blasphemy laws. We can argue over what constitutes blasphemy, but the idea that we can do without blasphemy is for the birds. I think it's a much more interesting question. What actually constitute? What do we consider blasphemous and why? I think is a much more interesting line of inquiry than than arguing interminably about whether or not we should have blasphemy laws. I mean, I think we could do with a better set of blasphemy laws than the ones we have, because the moral content of the ones we have is. I don't think the prognosis for it is very good, because
they're inconsistent. They're logically inconsistent as a set, which makes it impossible to talk about, right?
Not even that that's not even the problem. The problem is that they're fundamentally very atomistic. If
if the only thing which really constitutes a blasphemy is sinning against somebody's ability to define themselves wholly without any reference to reality or other people, then the logical endpoint of making that making selfhood your sacred value is a very brittle and actually a very volatile society, because I just don't see how it can end except in the sort of Hobbesian state of war of all against all, or alternatively the emergence of a new set of ideologies to try and keep a lid on that. But I don't see how we can not end up with Leviathan under those circumstances. So, which kind of speaks to everything that we've been discussing here. I remember coming across back in the days when I was reading theory at university, wandering off on funny down funny library rabbit holes that that had no relation to what I was meant to be reading about. And there was one phrase that stuck in my mind ever since, because I thought it was so prophetic, and I cannot remember for the life of me where it came from, which drives me crazy. But it was talking about this sort of post-structuralist idea of the transcendental signifier. This Derridean idea that every ideological system has a sort of has a kind of magical central point, which is the linchpin that holds the whole thing together. And this phrase picked up on that. So technology is the transcendental signifier for a pluralistic world. And the more pluralistic the world, the more we rely on technology to act as our transcendental signifier. It's the glue that holds us all together. And so we can only be this radically atomized because we have the internet to make us all feel like we still belong to something. And that was written 25, 30 years ago, and I feel like it's nothing that's happened since has disabused me of thinking that it's an incredibly prophetic observation.
Oh, absolutely.
And hate crime laws are really about creating an ever more pluralistic world, in which we're ever more reliant on technology as our transcendental signifier. In a sense, it's part of the same dynamic. If you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, but I do think that's an interesting point to contrast the Beijing versus the Washington cultural consensus from there, in that the Chinese Communist Party has worked very hard to harmonize people inside and outside, and to actually not indulge in the various different politics of identity in their pursuit of a much more managed society. Whereas the Western version thereof, which is, as I say, definitely tending in the same direction from a technological perspective, but the Western one has actually tried to get to that end of getting more submission to, in a very practical way, to rules and laws and a consensus through politics of division, which is, I think, quite an interesting
one
contrast.
Of the things I find
we encourage identity politics and they discourage it. So how does that win out?
I don't know. I mean, this is one of the things. It's one of the things I track that I find really interesting at the moment. I mean, I wrote something a little while ago about Chinese millennials, disaffected Chinese millennials, that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of Chinese feminism somewhat, which is a thing. And the fascinating takeaway I acquired from that rabbit hole was that in the West, feminism is regularly blamed for social atomization, the rise of divorce and single mothers and the sexual revolution, yada, yada, yada. A lot of people lay the blame for a lot of that at the door of feminism. But in China, feminism is a consequence of a lot of the social changes which in the West are blamed on feminism. In a sense, being both of them are following very similar paths.
Yes.
But the causality looks like it runs in opposite directions.
Yes.
And what I've been, and that sort of led me to a kind of crypto-Marxist take on the whole thing, which says, perhaps it's straightforwardly a fact that the material conditions of advanced techno-capitalism are sufficiently similar in both contexts that it doesn't matter which way you run the causality, somehow the upshot ends up being very similar, or having a lot of parallels across both contexts. Both countries are acquiring a class of disillusioned, disaffected, dropout millennials. Both of them are acquiring a collapsing birth rate. Both of them are acquiring angry women who feel torn between professional obligations and pressures to get married and have children. In both situations there are similarities which emerge out of the material conditions. A lot of which are just baked into the greater economic sort of systemic context. And it doesn't matter which direction you run the causality in, somehow the upshot seems to be very similar. And it's just too early to tell whether Xi Jinping's top-down efforts to mitigate some of the worst excesses of that will work or not. I mean, I'm afraid my money's on material conditions, but it's too early to tell. I don't know whether it's going to work or not.
Comfort hides a multitude of sins, right? I mean, this is what they've got right, that perhaps some of the more sort of 20th century regimes got very wrong. Like, if you actually are giving people a raising standard of living, you're not going to get much of a pushback. The challenge is, of course, they're going to be able to keep on doing that. But I suppose from my analysis, they probably are, because their economy is so closely tied to the US, and economics always come down to guns at the end of the day. Force drives finance, unfortunately. So I don't know, but it is quite interesting what you say there. I think it's come through quite a few of the points you made today. Sort of all roads lead to the same point. You can take very different routes to end up at a very similar situation. I think that is what is definitely, if not concerning, at least of note to a lot of people who work in the sort of futures and trend space like myself, that it seems like we are moving to a global consensus in effect, if not actually in communication. So we're still speaking as though there are different alternatives on the table, but it's all really the same policy. I mean, if you look at COVID, it was so extraordinary. Like, every country across the world adopted almost exactly the same policy things, and we argued about very small differences as if they mattered. I
think if there's anything that's coming down the line on this, it's that what I see us moving into, whether it's China or whether it's the West, is much more a system of governance that's oriented towards managing the politics of scarcity. We're moving out of the politics of abundance, and this is really about managing the politics of post-growth, where we've already left the era of never-ending growth. Nobody wants to talk about it, but that's happened. That's a done deal. We're now into the politics of scarcity. Whether that's finding a political narrative that makes it acceptable to reduce the number of people flying by aeroplane, or finding ways to explain the fact that not everything is available in the shops anymore. We're now into modes of governance which are oriented towards managing the politics of scarcity, and I think that's going to intensify over the next few decades, because you can't have never-ending growth. As David Attenborough rightly said, never-ending growth and never, on a planet of finite resources is, to believe in that, you have to be a madman or an idiot. And we're already at the point where actually only madmen and idiots believe that anymore, and our governance systems are moving into a mode which is oriented towards managing that. Peter Zayan, who I find very interesting on geopolitics, talks a lot about how China's wolf warrior diplomacy is really about creating it's really about speaking to a domestic audience and creating a sort of nationalistic fervor which is resilient enough to help China adjust to not just being able to fund eternal growth via eternal money printing anymore, because in fact that's already in the mail for China. The basis of the CCP's social contract till now has just been funding using bottomless bank loans to fund a kind of growth which then trickles down to the bourgeoisie and creates new millionaires and so on. And really and they're close to running out of road on that for a number of complex reasons. And that, and when they do run out of road, the only way they're going to be able to ensure any kind of internal social cohesion is by creating an external enemy. So a huge amount of what's going on, the wolf warrior thing is really about building that sort of social consensus and creating a new, slightly rather more belligerent social contract that will ensure coherence. I mean, you could probably map that out to other countries worldwide. I mean, geopolitics isn't really my beat, so I'm not going to risk myself on that. But I would say, there are similar trends are afoot elsewhere.
Similar from the economics point, but on the China story in particular, it is worth pausing there in that China's strategy has always been slightly different to literally every other empire on earth. I don't know if you've ever seen that famous histogram picture. It sort of just literally shows empires in color streams going down a page. If you haven't seen it, try to link it to this, but it's definitely worth looking at. And it shows the rise and fall of empires and how they took up space and then retreated. China is the only unbroken line on that map. And they go through periods of like a snake's belly. It sort of looks a bit like that. They and then when things get a bit risky, they retreat back into isolationism. And even in sort of living memory, you've seen China do that a few times, sort of venture out a bit and then pull back. It's very different to the more, I want to say, Western empires, because they haven't really been sort of dominating expansionary empires that didn't actually come out of the Western consensus. If you actually look at that map again, the Western models seem to be more like we go and take as much as we can, and then we overshoot ourselves. It's overshoot and collapse, much like that's too much growth story, right? I mean, like whether you're talking Roman or Byzantine or anything you look at over there, all those Middle Eastern European empires went too big and then sort of had to have massive pullbacks. So you end up with nice Mediterranean communities like Italy and Greece and all the rest of it, but hardly warring massive geopolitical powers left today. And that's quite interesting to look like. China's strategy has always been around sustainability rather than around growth. I'm not talking sustainability from doing good to the environment perspective, but it's been a survival focused empire, which I think is quite an interesting sort of contrast. So that perhaps they have better strategies at sticking power, perhaps they have better strategies about periods of boom and bust, but it's different worldviews and different sort of sense of continuity and what it means. And that's maybe an indictment on the rest of us who tend to have a much shorter time preference, much less patience, and much less who cares what happens next. Like let's do this right now. And if we want to look at that, I mean, there's not much that you can say against that when you look at what's happening in the world of completely virtualized finance right now. I think that's the point that we didn't touch on today, is how the financialized economy has decoupled from the real economy, probably to the largest extent ever in the course of history. We've had many bubbles and booms and busts and the rest of it. But the claims on the real economy have become so tenuous that really the only way they're enforced is through arbitrary rule by law. If you look at what's happening in property rights in the United States with like asset forfeitures at will, we think that we've got this sort of social contract that's set up according to a set of certain rules, but it's very Hobbesian when you get right down to it. The strong still take what they will, and the rest of us suffer what we must, right?
Yeah. Perhaps 'twas ever thus.
It's all just we sort of pretend otherwise in between, and I think we're in sort of a period of disenchantment as to believing our own fairy tales that we told ourselves about how our social contracts work for the good of all of us. We're sort of being forced to confront that that's not actually the case.
I think that's right. And it's not at all clear to me how the politics of scarcity is going to play out. I mean, I think one of the most under-discussed issues on the left, such as it is now, is the class politics of climate change. There is lip service paid to the class politics of climate change, but when you actually look at the class politics of climate policy, that's just not something that anybody's willing to touch. You know, you'll hear the left talk about how we must be welcoming to economic migrants from areas that have been badly affected by climate change. But you won't hear people talk about the knock-on effects on the working class domestically of environmental policies, which will have a damaging effect. But you only have to look at the Gilets jaunes riots in France to see what it looks like when you increase the levies on carbon on carbon consumption in a way which harms the working class freight industry or delivery drivers, or well, any number of people further down the social scale. And I mean, this is even before we get, for example, to the question of what we do about the incredibly harmful environmental effects of the contraceptive pill, and any number of other issues where the left comes into collision with itself. You know, the moment
nappies,
you leave,
right?
Right. Yeah.
Women must wash their own menstrual cups in their children's diapers, right? In order to save the planet, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
that goes straight in the face of gender politics and equality, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the and nobody wants to talk about it. I spent all of last year trying to sell a book on the conflicts between women's liberation and environmental politics, and everybody said this is forcefully argued and very interesting, but we don't want it.
We don't want to touch that. Don't get involved. Don't be on the wrong side of history.
No.
We're not doing that now. We are all buckling down. But I think you touched on a point that's very critical. And I do live in Africa. I live in one of the more developed, prosperous parts of Africa. I live in Johannesburg. I can hardly say that I live a third world or a developing world existence. But the politics of climate change from a geopolitical perspective too are also hugely under-discussed about who actually is being asked to carry these costs. And the big elephant in the room is that the reason that we are facing such a crisis at the moment is not actually because of big bad businesses and because of, elites that overshoot their own particular resources. There's actually not too many of them. And the big bad businesses are the big bad businesses that are keeping the lights on for people in places like South Africa through coal-fueled electricity. And that a lot of the damage that's being done right now and that we're trying to mitigate against is really due to the fact that a whole lot of people are trying to drag themselves out of poverty, talking whole generations, whole continents worth of people are wanting what the developed West already has. And the unspoken consensus in the room is that really we're saying, you shouldn't actually have that. We've eaten the cake and that there's actually none left for anyone else. So you get to pay the bill and we're going to leave now. So yeah, very, very, very uncomfortable conversations, but we've been talking for a long time. This has been great. Do you want to have any closing comments? Do you want to tie any threads together? And how do we get hold of you if you want to continue this conversation?
No, I think this is the commodification of everything, the politics of decline, the end of progress, the class politics of scarcity. If we were going to have a properly black-pilled conversation, Bronwyn, this was always going to be, let's face it. I think that's a pretty good place to sum up. I mean, we don't really have any answers, but I think we've sketched out some of the big questions. This has been amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.